So bakit importante, in other words, um, that we can, um, you know, uh, we need to somehow look at this statement, Philippine languages are dialects, as problematic, all right? That we need to change it to Philippine languages are not dialects. Because some of you in the question sometimes also ask, is it really important, whether these are languages and dialects. But as I mentioned, there's so much to this statement than just simply this statement. There's so much history that gets into it. There's so much politics that gets into it. There's so much of our identity that gets into it as well. So by being able to say Philippine languages are not dialects, all right, there are five things that it actually does to us. The first one is this one. It recognizes and addresses inequalities of multilingualism. All right. Why? We need to recognize the fact, first and foremost, that there's such a thing as inequalities of multilingualism. We can be proud of the many different languages that we have in the country, but many of these languages are not valued equally, or these languages are not valued equally. And so to be able to say that these Philippine languages are not dialects, we are in a position now to start thinking about, okay, so saan galing yung inequalities? Ano yung mga inequalities of multilingualism? And so for many of you who might want to start off, thinking about your own research, so it's a whole range of work, of issues that you can actually tackle. There's so much, Kanina, I started with accentism as well. That's one aspect, very, very just one small aspect of inequalities of multilingualism. There are many more. You can talk about inequalities of multilingualism in relation to education access and access to education, for example, and so on and so forth. So just by naming the Philippine languages as not languages, but as dialects, you already start surfacing many of these inequalities of multilingualism. You're already surfacing many of these discussions that have got something to do with, power and politics behind multilingualism. Second, it revalues, othered Philippine languages. In other words, when you are talking about Philippine languages are dialects, you have, in a sense, we have participated in the othering of Philippine languages. Iba sila, all right? Othering also means like we have marginalized them, we have silenced them to the point that the speakers of these languages sometimes, do not have to take control of, their own future. Kaya ang sinabi kanina ni Tomas, the Bicolano member of Alamat, na, because he was in the entertainment business much earlier before Alamat, that he was not cast, in very important, advertising opportunities and even news, even teleserye, halimbawa, because of just simply the way he spoke. Because that's simply by his accent. In other words, there's something that has got something to do with, your future. The opportunities are somehow, closed to some extent, precisely just because of the language that you use, just because of the accents that you produce as well. So by naming Philippine languages as languages and not as dialects, you help revalue. May value din kasi pantay-pantay dapat ang Philippine languages natin. All right, if we just simply look at them through the lens, for example, of of languages, of linguistics, for example. So when you say revalue, then you go back. So anong mga values dati ay ano siya? Nakakatanda, halimbawa. All right? All right? In case nakakatanda, all right? Yung mga Philippine languages ko. And in fact, there's someone who that just I read yesterday, basically said, she said something like, she asked her mom, why did the mom not teach her waray? And I think the answer of the mom is, sino kausapin mo? Sino gusto mo kausapin? Diba? Without realizing that actually, pwede niyang kausapin nanay niya. Diba? All right? So I guess this has also something to do with the revaluing of other Philippine languages as well. Number 3, it corrects historical wrongs. All right? Yung tinuruan tayo na halimbawa na yung mga lingwahe natin ay hindi ganoon importante. Yung tinuruan tayo na yung kulay natin hindi ganoon importante or mas mababang tingin sa atin. Yung tinuruan tayo na yung mga literature natin, yung mga pagsulat natin in different regional writings, for example, yung tinuruan tayo na yung kultura natin na hindi ganoon ka-importante, all the traditions, kasi hindi siya ang dominante na mga kultura ng panahon ng kolonyalismo, for example. I think by doing this, by naming Philippine languages as not dialects and as languages, we are able to correct certain historical wrongs as well. And number 4, well, here, we can then promote their use in music. We can then promote their use in the literature. We can then promote their use in school. All right, because if we revalue, our Philippine languages, then we then start surfacing some of these feelings and emotions that have been pent up through the years. Kung makita nyo lang in our responses, for example. So it enriches, for example, it enriches our understanding of multilingualism, of linguistic diversity as well. And the idea being that, of course, with these languages, we can learn who we are. It's not so much, like going back to the past, really, to be honest. It's drawing on our past, it's drawing on what we have, but also embracing what's instead, what's in there for us, in the future. So it's really more like, keeping this balance between what globalization, what cosmopolitanism, can actually help us with. But at the same time, our traditions and cultures, you merge them, you bring them together to produce something different. All right. So hindi yung babalikan mo, but you draw on the past and you use this past and use your traditions and cultures in order to move forward and embrace, basically globalization and embrace, what's in there. All right. It can offer. And lastly, and this, I think, to me, something very, very important. It recognizes multilingualism as a resource. Hindi po problema ang multilingualism. Let's do away with this whole problematic thinking that because the Philippines has many languages, then it is, the reason why we are not doing well. All right? No, multilingualism is a resource. Tinuruan kasi tayo na yung problema natin ay yung dahil marami tayong salita. No, we should tap into multilingualism as a resource. It's not a problem, all right? Even in the context of language education, we have to look at what our, pupils bring along with them into the classroom and use these as a way to understand them more and use this as part of how we can actually improvise and, improve on our own language teaching pedagogy, right? There's just no way for us. I mean, not no way, but there's just it's problematic to think of multilingualism as a problem that should be eradicated. That's not, I think, how we should be doing it, because again, this idea of multilingualism that needs to be eradicated, multilingualism as a problem, is a historical construction. All right, and what we are doing now is basically just to correct all of these misconceptions. That when we're talking about Philippine languages as languages, not dialects, we are actually acknowledging that multilingualism, the many different languages that we have in the Philippines, all right, are resources that we can use to know who we are, to narrate, our own histories as a nation, right? And more specifically, in more detail, if we are educators, to use these languages to, to improve learning in our own different school institutions as well. It's just basically that it's ideological to me to think that these are problems. I think we need to change these mindsets now, all these 5, to be able to move forward with language and education in the Philippines.